My name is Claire. I was born and raised in Provence, in a small stone town surrounded by vineyards and lavender fields. Life here followed rules long before I understood them. As a girl, I learned what was expected of me without anyone ever saying it out loud. Women belonged to the home, to family duty, to silence. Our value was measured by reputation, not by happiness. I spent most of my days among other women. This was common then. We cooked together, washed clothes by the river, worked in gardens, shared rooms during winter because firewood was expensive. Men were often away, and female companionship was normal, even encouraged. Historians later would call this homosocial life. But to us, it was simply how the world functioned. Yet within that closeness, things were complicated. We relied on each other for warmth, for support, for understanding. There were no words for certain feelings, no space to question them. Education for women was limited, especially when it came to emotions or identity. Anything that didn't fit marriage or motherhood simply wasn't discussed. I remember becoming aware of myself in small, quiet ways, not through actions, but through thoughts I quickly pushed aside. A sense of unease when I noticed how easily another woman's presence affected my mood, a tension I couldn't explain. In those days, feelings weren't explored. They were managed, controlled, buried under routine. Society left no room for deviation. Even rumors could destroy a woman's future. So we learned caution early. We learned how to look ordinary, how to behave correctly, how to keep our inner lives hidden. This is important to understand when speaking about women's relationships in historical Provence. Discretion was not a choice, it was survival. At the time, I didn't think of any of this as forbidden desire. I thought of it as confusion, as restlessness, as something wrong with me. I believed it would pass if I stayed busy enough, obedient enough. But the feeling lingered, quiet and unresolved, like a thought waiting for permission to exist. And that was how it always began in those days. Not with love, not with touch, but with silence. With questions no one was allowed to ask. It was around that time that Margarite became part of my daily life. We had always known each other in passing, as women often did in small towns, but circumstances brought us closer. She helped her family with weaving, and our paths crossed often, at the market, by the river, in shared workspaces where women gathered to complete tasks together. In those days, women formed strong bonds out of necessity. This was socially acceptable. We were expected to rely on one another emotionally, as long as it appeared practical and modest. Sitting close while working, sharing meals, walking together, none of this raised suspicion. Society saw it as harmless companionship. Marguerite was calm, observant. She spoke little, but when she did, people listened. I noticed how silence felt different when she was near. Not uncomfortable, just full. There were moments when our eyes met for no reason at all, and neither of us looked away immediately. I told myself it meant nothing. I had been taught that it must mean nothing. We spent hours working side by side, hands moving in rhythm, conversations drifting between practical matters and quiet reflections. Sometimes our fingers brushed as we passed tools or fabric. These moments were small, almost invisible, yet they stayed with me longer than they should have. I became more aware of my own thoughts, more careful with them. Historically, this kind of closeness between women was common and rarely questioned. Letters and records from the period show how deeply women relied on one another for emotional support. What was not recorded, what lived only between moments, was how difficult it could be to separate friendship from something more when no framework existed to understand it. Inside me, there was a conflict I couldn't name. Part of me felt comforted by her presence. Another part felt uneasy, alert. I worried not about Marguerite, but about myself, about what it meant that I noticed her absence more than others, that her quiet approval mattered to me more than it should have. Nothing happened. That is important to say. Our lives continued as expected, but anticipation grew in the spaces between words, in pauses that lingered too long, in shared walks where conversation faded and neither of us rushed to fill the silence. I was torn between fear and something that felt like recognition. I didn't allow myself to imagine outcomes. In that era, imagination itself could be dangerous. So I stayed where it was safe, in observation, in restraint, in pretending that what I felt was simply companionship shaped by circumstance. Still, something had shifted. I could sense it, even if I refused to acknowledge it fully. The connection was there, quiet and undefined, waiting. And in a world where women were taught to endure rather than to choose, that waiting carried its own weight. There came a moment when pretending stopped working. Not because something happened, but because something became impossible to ignore. It was during an ordinary evening, one of many, when the work was done and the room grew quiet. Margarite sat across from me, the light low, the sounds of the town distant. Nothing about the scene was unusual, yet everything felt exposed. I became aware of how carefully I was breathing, of how my thoughts were racing while my face remained still. In that silence, I understood something clearly for the first time, not as desire, but as truth. What I felt was not confusion born of loneliness, it was recognition, and that realization frightened me more than uncertainty ever had. In historical terms, this is where many women of that era found themselves trapped. Without language, without models, without permission to define their inner lives, awareness itself became the crisis. There were no choices to weigh openly, only consequences to fear. A woman could lose her standing, her safety, her family's trust, all without ever having done anything wrong. Marguerite spoke softly, about ordinary matters, yet her voice shook slightly. I noticed it because I was listening too closely, because I sensed that she, too, was standing at the edge of something unnamed. Tears gathered in my eyes, not from sadness alone, but from the weight of restraint, from knowing that whatever existed between us had no place in the world we lived in. I felt torn between instinct and survival, between the comfort of honesty and the protection of silence. My thoughts raced. What if this was seen? What if it was misunderstood? What if even acknowledging it changed everything? In that era, emotional awareness carried risk equal to action. We did not speak of it. That too was typical. Historical records rarely show moments of confession. Instead, they show endurance, endings without explanation, bonds that faded quietly or were redirected into socially acceptable forms. What mattered was control, over expression, over impulse, over the self. Yet inside me, something irreversible had happened. I could not return to ignorance. I understood now that what bound us was real, even if it remained unspoken, and that knowledge stayed with me, heavy and undeniable, long after the moment passed. The peak was not a declaration, it was acceptance, of fear, of truth, of limits. And in a world that demanded obedience, that internal reckoning was the most dangerous thing of all. Time moved on, as it always does. Life continued along the paths laid out for women like me. Duties replaced questions. Routine softened sharp edges. Marguerite remained part of my world for some time, then less so, as marriages, obligations, and distance slowly reshaped our lives. Nothing ended dramatically. That, too, was common. With age came perspective. I began to understand that what we experienced was not unusual for women of that period. Historians would later uncover letters, diaries, and accounts revealing how deeply women depended on one another emotionally. These relationships existed quietly, often unnamed, shaped by social necessity and limited choices rather than by freedom. What mattered was not what we did, but what we learned to carry. That connection taught me awareness of myself, of others, of the cost of silence. It showed me how many women lived full emotional lives that history almost erased because they did not fit official narratives. I did not regret the restraint. It kept us safe in a world that offered little mercy to those who stepped outside its rules. But I also did not forget. The memory remained, not as loss, but as understanding, as proof that even within strict boundaries, human connection found ways to exist. Looking back, I no longer see fear as weakness. I see it as a response to reality. In Provence, in those centuries, love did not always take visible forms. Sometimes it survived only as memory, as influence, as quiet change within a person. That is why stories like this matter. Not to judge the past, but to understand it. To recognize the lives that were lived carefully, thoughtfully, and often invisibly. The relationships between women were not scandals or exceptions. They were part of the social fabric, shaped by circumstance and constrained by expectation. I carried that knowledge forward. It shaped how I listened, how I observed, how I understood others. And though my life followed the path required of me, I knew something essential about myself that no one could take away. In the end, that was enough.